Good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us for this morning's webinar from CalPERS leadership team. The topic of conversation is a review of the ALM decisions that were recently completed by the CalPERS board and team and the path forward. I'm David Takearts. I'm the Stakeholder Strategy Manager for CalPERS. And in a moment, I'll be turning it over to our moderator to get into the material. Just a few quick housekeeping notes. I'm sure this isn't your first or 12th Zoom webinar over the last 20 months or so. But in general, we're doing the concept here is sort of the darkened theater where all of you can see us and hear us, but we can't really hear you. So throughout the presentation, if you have questions or comments, please go ahead and type them into the chat box. You should see that somewhere there on your device. Type those into the chat as opposed to the Q&A. That way everyone can see the questions and 27 people don't type in the exact same question because you're not able to see what each other are typing. So go ahead and type those in as we go through. And we'll take those questions. If those questions are super pertinent to that exact moment in time, we'll answer them throughout. But for the most part, we'll probably want to push most of the questions to the end for the Q&A portion once you've heard the full material that we're going to go over. We are going to go ahead and share these slides just as soon as the webinar is over. So we'll be able to get those to you, all of you, right afterwards. And the time slot that we have set aside here is 1 hour. So we'll look to wrap this up at around noon today so you can all get to lunch. All right, so with no further ado, let me go ahead and turn it over to our moderator for today's session, Mr. Brad Pacheco, who is the Deputy Executive Officer for Communications and Stakeholder Relations at CalPERS. Go ahead, Brad.
Thanks, David, and good morning, everyone. Appreciate you taking the time to join us today. If you've been with us on some of our previous webinars on this topic, welcome back. And if you're new to this topic, we hope this time today will help get you up to speed on the work that we've been doing and more importantly, the decisions that have been made by our CalPERS board recently. So the agenda that we have for you is we're going to talk a little bit about the work we did leading up to the proposals that were given to the CalPERS board. And then we'll get into the actual outcome of the decision. That'll include the discount rate, the actuarial assumptions that were used, and also what the makeup of our investment portfolio is going to look like over the next 4 years. Then we'll move into the impacts the decision has on employers, the impact it has on member contributions, and how we're going to implement this over the next coming months. So as David said, please, we're here to answer your questions. We've got a prepared presentation, but we'll have plenty of time at the end to answer any questions that you may have. So today I'm joined by 3 of my colleagues, and that includes Michael Cohen, our Chief Financial Officer, Scott Turando, our Chief Actuary, and Sterling Gunn, our Managing Investment Director. And we're just going to get underway, so I'll turn it over to Michael Cohen.
Thanks, Brad, and good morning, everybody. So this first slide sort of recaps where we've been leading up to the November board decision on ALM. So we did start this process over a year ago. Just as a recap for all of you, it is a once every 4-year process by which we sort of kick the tires on all of our underlying actuarial and investment assumptions and ultimately lead to a new asset allocation of how we're going to invest the fund's nearly $500 billion. Then partway through our process, we had the tremendous returns of 21.3% for the fiscal year. That triggered our funding risk mitigation policy for the first time. I'll talk about that over the next couple of slides. But the short version is this policy basically pulled down our discount rate from 7% to 6.8% automatically on July 1st of 2021. Then in September, our board adopted the capital market assumptions that underlay all of the rest of the process. Not surprisingly, this had been a long-term trend in terms of expectations coming down over what future markets were going to yield but it certainly happened a lot faster with the pandemic than I think folks were expecting. And so the bottom line was our current asset allocation was expected to only yield 6.2% going forward, even though it had been constructed to sort of target that original 7%. So that's kind of the groundwork we were working from. And as a result, the board asked for more detailed portfolios between 6.5% and 7%, including the 6.8% version that matched up with our funding risk mitigation policy. So let's talk a little bit more about the risk mitigation policy. This is a policy that was put in place in 2015 by our board, and really kind of knowing that the long-term expectations were coming down over time, as I mentioned. So they sort of knew that the 7% was unlikely to be the target for the long term. And rather than just sort of take the big chunks at it as they came, like we did when we went from 7.5% to 7%, they put in this policy that basically in the good years notched down the discount rate. So you see here, there were these bands basically that start at 2% more than our discount rate. So 9% under the old system, all the way up to more than 24%. And basically, because we hit the 21%, you see there that we pulled the discount rate down by 20 basis points, down from 7% to 6.8%. And our next slide really illustrates how this risk mitigation policy works by using the good years to nudge down the discount rate. The black line here was sort of the original expectations that you would have seen a year ago in terms of what you could expect to happen with your rates under a 7% discount rate. If there was nothing, you would have had the blue line, you would have seen rates drop pretty significantly under a 21% return as those got phased in. And instead, what the risk mitigation policy does is sort of take the middle ground, the orange line you see here, where they're splitting the difference between sort of leaving things at the higher discount rate and taking the opportunity of the good year to reduce the discount rate. And so you end up with sort of this moderating effect of, in good years, we nudge down the discount rate rather than facing a decision that might sort of overlap with a poor year at the same time that you're phasing in some poor investment returns which would cause rate increases. Instead, when you're in the good years, you take the opportunity under the risk mitigation policy to nudge the discount rate down, and that reduces the risks that the investment office has to take going forward. And so that's sort of my segue to turn this over to Sterling and dive deeper into the investment world and what we looked at through the ALM process.
Thank you very much, Michael. So yeah, I'll spend a few minutes doing that and land where the portfolio was actually chosen. But the messaging throughout the ALM process really was about trying to strike a balance between risk and reward. And here we have some of the key criteria. We'd shared with the board, sort of a list of decisions and pros and cons related with those decisions. And what you will see, of course, is one of the decisions was around the percentage of private assets. And you'll see that we've increased the percentage of private assets in the portfolio for a number of reasons, combined with basically a view that they have higher returns than sort of the public equivalents and are a bit of a diversifier. One of the second decisions had to do with leverage. And I will admit, certainly in the press, there's been some confusion about our motivation for leverage. Our motivation in allocating to leverage was not to increase returns, but rather to help manage and reduce risk. And you can see that quite clearly in the materials where we showed two portfolios, both of which had projected returns of 6.8%. One, however, had leverage and it actually had lower risk. So that really was our intent in discussing the use of leverage, was to help manage and to lower risk in the portfolio as opposed to juicing returns, which I've read in some of the press. We also had to balance that against the tolerance for drawdown risk. And so drawdown risk was something new that we introduced in this particular cycle. And I'll get into some of the details in a second in a slide dedicated to this discussion. But we just felt the idea of loss of drawdown risk was more closely aligned with our constitutional objectives around minimizing losses. So that was that choice there. And then also the employer's ability to pay. That is a risk, right? If the costs are too high, that obviously increases stress on the employer. So all these things had to be balanced. So it was actually a lot of moving parts for our board to actually have to consider as they tried to strike the right balance between reward and risk. Go to the next slide, please. So here we have an illustration schematic of drawdown risk. And if you look at the bell curve on the left, excuse me 1 second. The idea here is there's the potential for gains and losses in any portfolio. And to focus on the losses, we focused on the left-hand side of the range of outcomes, and in particular, the extreme outcomes, which we've highlighted in the red there. So our definition was it's the average of the worst 10% of 3-year losses. So this diagram, if we were to put the range of potential 3-year outcomes in place, and then we look at the losses, and then we look at that little deep tail highlighted in red, we take the average value. That's how we measure drawdown risk. And our intent then was, of course, to try to minimize that risk when trying to deliver returns. Let's go to the next slide, please. So here were the portfolios that we presented as candidates in November. We have the current portfolio, as Michael mentioned, under the current CMAs. Its projected return was 6.2%, had risk of 22.6% as drawdown, and a volatility of 11.2%. So the question was, could we do better? And the answer was, the portfolios we offered, we thought all did better in different ways. A1 through C1. So you see, for example, the discount rates associated with the projected return are certainly higher than the current portfolio, 6.5, 6.8, and 7, as Michael mentioned. We also see that the risk in some is lower. So in the A1 and A2 portfolios, and it's slightly higher with the B1, B2, and C1 choices, but you get much better returns. And again, that sort of illustrates the trade-off between risk and return. The important thing here is that all these portfolios are probably a better choice than the current one because the market had changed. Go to the next slide, please. So here, what are the outcomes? Well, the board selected a portfolio that is associated with a discount rate of 6.8%. So it's basically staying the course with what had happened after the risk mitigation strategy. 6.8%, we kept it there. The portfolio they chose was portfolio B2. We'll get into some of the details in a second there. We did, as I mentioned earlier, introduce a strategic asset allocation to leverage for the reason I mentioned, which is diversifying the portfolio and trying to reduce risk. And we did increase allocation to private assets. We'll see that. Also, we did, of course, adopt some new actuarial assumptions. All these things led to the changes that motivated the choice of this particular portfolio. Go to the next slide. So now we have the joy of actually implementing. And some of the changes can be made quickly, others will have to be done slowly, but we will be presenting a plan to the board on how we will implement this new portfolio by July 2022. And the important thing is in this plan that we be careful in terms of how we manage this implementation, and then we are going to focus on being opportunistic. If we were sort of mechanistic in the approach, if we just decided to buy private equity on a scheduled basis, basically the world would get ahead of us on that and wait, and we'd probably pay prices we wouldn't want to pay. So instead, what we will do is monitor the market and be opportunistic in terms of when we engage in terms of making these changes, knowing that we will have to make these changes probably over years. And all of this is to try to mitigate the market impact that it could have on the prices. Notable changes that we have here, again, the private assets, significant jump in terms of the total allocated to them from 21 to about 1/3 of the portfolio. The addition of the leverage I've mentioned. And in order to support all this, there is a reduction of public equity exposure. That's actually a good thing. We're actually diversifying the portfolio. Go to the next slide, please. So this is the current portfolio on the left and the adopted portfolio on the right, labeled the 6.8% portfolio, B2. So what are the key differences here? Well, the use of leverage. So you notice at the very bottom of the right-hand column, the little purple area, -5%, that's the leverage. Because we did use a bit of leverage, you notice the height of the column is a little bit higher. It's 5% higher than the current portfolio. And that represents the fact we actually have more assets on a gross basis. You'll also notice, though, that the overall equity exposures and public equity exposures are lower. So the two lower blue areas are the public equity. In the current portfolio, they were 35 and 15% respectively for the two public equity allocations. So they go from 50% to 42%. You do see an increase in fixed income products, which are diversifiers relative to the public equities. So for example, you do see investment grade corporates, mortgage-backed securities, emerging market sovereign bonds, all of these things both improve returns and the diversification in the portfolio. So go to the next slide, please. So where have we landed? So here we have the, in terms of leverage, the board approved the 5%. The current leverage that we have today is primarily in the real estate benchmark, plus some discretionary amounts. And if you think about our board policy, we have the benchmark leverage, which is, as I mentioned, in the real estate benchmark. I forget, it's about 3% on the total portfolio. We do have some discretion to use leverage, and we use a small amount of that discretion today, but not a lot. The idea here, though, is it's pretty straightforward, that we are using borrowed money to buy assets. So we have a whole function within the investment office to manage financing of this thing. So we believe that we're quite comfortable doing this. And as I mentioned, we're using leverage to improve diversification. This strategic allocation, that is its purpose, is to help us better manage the risk in the portfolio. It broadens the tool set that we have to manage risk, and that'll be very beneficial in the long run. As I mentioned, I think there's been some misrepresentations or misunderstandings around the use of leverage. We aren't using it to buy more private assets. If you look at the allocations on the previous page, basically the amount of private assets is the same in both those portfolios. So we could have done levered or unlevered and had the same amount of private assets. We would have had the same projected returns. The big difference in the two portfolios is the level of risk. Leverage gave us lower risk. Now, what are the risks with leverage? It does add some complexity to the portfolio, but we've been doing this for a while on a discretionary basis, so we believe we understand it. We're very capable of doing this. There are, potential for higher losses. Certainly, when we think about drawdown risk, there's many different circumstances that can create drawdown risk. The circumstances by which the diversification benefits in this portfolio would not be available are much rarer than I think the broader sort of risks that we're used to. So although it's possible to have higher risks in some market conditions, they aren't very likely. So if we go to the next slide, please. So here we just want to talk a little bit again about the benefits of the private asset classes. And if we have the relative to their public equivalents, they do tend to be higher returning. They are diversifiers, and there's a number of reasons for that. One benefit we don't talk about very often, but it gives us access or easier access to parts of the economy that are not necessarily readily available in the public markets. So for example, real estate is a good example of that. But even in the private equity markets, the markets have evolved over time. We're now in a position where a lot of innovation is occurring in private companies, and private companies tend to be deferring the point at which they become public. So if we want to participate in innovation and the associated growth, then we have to consider private equity. Go to the next slide, please. So I think this actually is more to Scott now. So I will hand the discussion over to Scott.
All right, sorry about that. One of the major decisions that the board made in November was on the discount rate. The discount rate was set by the risk mitigation policy. As Michael mentioned, it dropped it from 7 to 6.8%. And that was affirmed by the board in November, along with the new asset allocation. So the discount rate, in terms of impact on cost, when we decrease the discount rate, there's an increase in the normal cost. There's an increase in the liability and the corresponding unfunded liability as well. And these impacts on both normal costs and the unfunded liability get reflected in the upcoming contribution rates. For the state and schools plans, you're going to see these effective for the 22-23 fiscal year. And for public agencies, they take effect a little bit later, 1 year later. We have a 1 year longer delay for the public agencies. And so you'll see these reflected in the 23-24 fiscal year for public agencies. When we were looking at the outcome for the ALM, there are a number of factors. I mean, the asset allocation and the discount rate were, I think, front and center and a major part of the discussion that the board talked about during November. But we also have to remember there was also a lot of changes on the actuarial side in terms of assumptions. There were additional changes, both inflation, mortality, and a number of other decrements kind of listed here. So when you take all those into consideration, as well as the investment gain, the question comes up, well, what's the impact on the employer contributions? So we have, we've kind of outlined here some of the bigger areas as examples here. For the state miscellaneous plan, we anticipate a slight decrease of around 0.5%. Basically, schools plans, we anticipate, negative 0.1%. You can basically consider that as even. And if you look for both the public agency miscellaneous and safety plans, we see around a medium change of about 0%. Now, keep in mind, there's wide variations on miscellaneous and safety plans. There are ranges, and some plans will have a decrease, and there'll be other plans that will see an increase in contributions. It depends upon your particular situation and plan dynamics. Next slide, Dave. So what we have here is we have contribution rate projections. We have a sample agency for miscellaneous and a safety plan as well. I think the key aspect you can take away here is if you look, the blue line is what we anticipated with a 7% return and the 7% discount rate. And the orange line is where we see things after taking into consideration all the changes that we just discussed. You can see we see the rates tend to trend down. You can see they trend down over the next couple years as we implement the gain in the investment side. You can also see as well, we just see a trending down on the overall contributions on the safety side as well as the miscellaneous side. Going on to the next slide, we see similar things on the schools and the state miscellaneous plan, just a general trending down. And the takeaway you can get from these, the last two slides, as well as the one that Michael presented earlier, is that compared to where we were and the expected rates to be, we see rates trending down for the majority of the plans. Next slide. A question that often comes up is, we talk about sample plans, school plans, miscellaneous safety plans, but when you look at your individual plan, there's a lot more variability in where the rates are, and this is kind of for those who aren't aware of this. We do have a web-based tool out there. It's called Pension Outlook. I think the link will be provided in the chat. And, this is an easy tool for employers, or in fact, anyone to go out and look at and model expected changes in contributions for their plan. You will have to make some certain changes and input some parameters. In this example, it's kind of hard to see, but you would want to make sure that you put the 21.3% for the first year's rate of return, change the discount rate to 6.8, and make future expected 6.8% returns if you want to see, example, where the discount rate impact would have on your particular plan. I will want to make note that using this tool does not reflect the changes in the demographic assumptions. These are just based off the 2020 valuations, just came out just over a couple months ago. We are looking to see if we can get those upgraded changes of assumptions incorporated into this. And as we get closer to that coming out, we'll let everyone know when it's available. Besides the employers, the CalPERS members themselves are also affected. Obviously, all these decisions go to strengthen the sustainability of the pension plan and provide a much solid, better foundation for funding the system. It's listed here for active classic members, but I think it really applies to all active members. In that with the change of assumptions, there'll be a slight change in the calculations on your optional factors when people retire, as well as some slight changes and increases on service purchase credits. For the PEPR members, we anticipate contribution increases in the majority of the plans. And as you can see, we have an average of around 0.8% of pay. So anywhere from almost 1% increase in contributions for members for most of the public agency plans. And for the retired members, none of these changes really have an impact on benefits or the COLA. So, in terms of PEPR members, what kind of drives that change in PEPR rates? You start the first kind of bullet there or graphic, the discount rate was changed and the assumptions was changed. And those changes combine to have an impact on the normal cost. So when you have a normal cost, we make a comparison between the normal cost after all the changes are incorporated, and we compare it to the base normal cost. The base normal cost is defined as the last time there was a change in your what's called your PEPR normal cost. It's just, that number can be found in your actual valuation. It's listed there. It's different for every group. If there's a 1% more change in the normal cost between the new calculated normal cost and the base normal cost, there will be a corresponding increase in the PEPR member share. That share is calculated. We take half the normal cost, and then the employee portion is rounded to the nearest 0.25%. Go ahead and move forward, David. So in terms of implementation timeline, you can kind of see the history on the far left, working from the left to right. We've worked through the June, July, November, and we're currently in November and December here. As Sterling mentioned, the new asset allocation will be implemented and a process proposed to the board over the next several months. And we'll be looking at calculating the new valuations based on all these changes. Those impacts, as mentioned earlier, for state and schools, the 22-23 fiscal year, and then for public agencies a year later for the 23-24 fiscal year. And this is for both the Pepper member contributions as well as the employer contributions. Some key dates for the state plans. In January, we're going to have an addendum to the actual evaluation. It'll come out and it'll provide updated projections based on all the recent changes. In April, the board will be presented with the new contribution rates for both the employer and several employee groups. And in July, those rates will become effective. For the schools, it's the same dates, and it's the same items here. It follows the state. In January, we have the addendum. We bring the new rates in April, and they become effective in July of 2022. And finally, for the public agencies, it's a little bit different. In December of this year, we're going to have a circular letter outlining and providing a lot more detail on the impact of the assumptions and providing, I think, more guidance on how you can get those estimates. In August of 2022, generally the valuations come out. The June 2021 valuations will be available and uploaded during August, and these will set the 23-24 contribution rates for both Pepper members as well as the employers. And then these rates kick in July 1st on 2023. And I will pass it back to Brad at this point.
Thanks, Scott. And thank you, Michael and Sterling, for that presentation. So if you do have any questions on what we just spoke about, now would be the time to put those in the chat. And we do have a couple questions here that I'll go to. The first is, what was the logic behind reducing the inflation rate from 2.5% to 2.3%, and how will this impact plan funded status? Is that something, Scott, you want to take?
Sure. So, when we looked at the inflation rate, we looked at it, we take a long-term perspective on the inflation rate. And obviously right now, inflation is running hot and it's a little bit higher than it has been. But when we set the valuation assumptions, we worked jointly with the investment office in terms of looking at inflation and long-term expectations on it. And it was felt that by everything we're seeing, the 2.3 was where we winded up in terms of a long-term expectation in terms of inflation. How does this impact your funded status? It actually makes it higher, and it makes your costs lower. By having a lower inflation, your expected benefits are lower, your expected salaries are lower, and with if you keep the discount rate locked in and you drop your inflation, you're increasing your real rate of return, which also increases your expected return and decreases your cost. If we had kept the 2.5 inflation, the cost overall would have been higher throughout the whole system as well.
Thanks, Scott. And then Scott, for the school employers, do you anticipate two employer rates, one for Classic and one for Pepper members?
No, we provide just one employer rate. It's at the schools, it's a pool, and both the PEPRA members as well as the Classic members are combined to give one overall rate for employers. The same thing exists for the state. We don't have separate PEPRA and Classic member rates or employer rates, as well as non-pooled public agencies. We just have one overall rate that's a blend of both the Classic employees and PEPRA employees. We do separate the information. That information is split out so you can see what the normal cost for a Classic member is and the PEPRA members. That information is available, but when we set rates overall, we base it just on a blended rate.
All right, Scott. And then I'm going to stick with you one last question here. Will our actuarials be available to review our pension outlook calculations and help determine the order of magnitude impact to specific agencies prior to the August 2022 actuarial reports?
Yeah, we're in the process of trying to provide as much information as we can. Kind of the challenge we have is we're working on the 2021 valuations, and we're also trying to get estimates out based on the 2020 vals so people can make decisions. So we have kind of trying to do competing things at the same time, just to provide the employers the information they need. We are trying to see if we can get pension outlook updated with the additional change in assumptions. And so employers and stakeholders can get a more accurate impact on their system. But if you have individual questions, feel free to call your actuary, and they should be able to help provide some information to you and give you and help answer any questions that you do have on your rates.
Great, thank you, Scott. So we had a question here about whether there's a write-up on all of these concepts that public agencies can use to inform their boards and councils. And that's very important to us. We want to make sure that your city councils, your boards understand the impact to these decisions and all the work that's gone into these. I know we cover a lot of material in these slide decks, so let us take a look at what we have and see if we can put something together that summarizes this. There are agenda items that were presented to our board that do a good job at summarizing the recommendations, but we'll look at all those and send some recommendations out through our stakeholder relations team that you can use to educate boards and councils. Question for Michael, the risk mitigation policy that you talked about, will it continue in the future where the discount rate is lowered each year when the returns exceed the discount rate?
Thanks, Brad. Yes, under its current framework, the policy does continue. One of the requests of our board at our November board meeting was to come back with a discussion that will likely happen in February in terms of the various policies that affect employers, the risk mitigation policy being certainly one of those. So I would suspect that we'll continue to have discussions with our board about that policy, but the short answer is yes, it continues to operate in future years.
All right, thanks, Michael. And then in the actuarial assumptions section of the board packet, and I'm assuming we're referring to the recent board agenda items, the 6.8% discount rate appeared to correspond to meaningful increases in employer contributions for public agencies. This presentation shows a median 0% impact on employers. Is the difference due to the buy down from the funding risk mitigation policy? Is that something, Scott?
Yeah, I can talk to that.
Okay.
Now, there's a lot of material, so it depends on which section you're looking at. If you look at the information in FAC, the FAC item, that just reflected the impact. We had the impact on what the demographic assumptions were. What was the impact on the demographic assumptions? I would say you need to look in the investment committee material, and if you look through towards the back, and definitely it was in the appendix, we kind of break down, I think by benefit formula, what the 6.8% range was. And that there was a large range, and there will be employers that have rate increases, and there will be also employers that have rate decreases. It just happened that the median turned out to be 0. Half the plans are so if you think about it, if the median is 0, half the plans are going to have a rate decrease and half the plans will have a rate increase. How large that is, I think, the range was much larger for the safety plans. For the miscellaneous plans, not so much, but there are going to be increases for, about half the plans out there. It just happens that that median worked out to be 0 for just how it worked out in this case.
All right, thank you, Scott. David, could you
Oh,
go
so-
back? Go ahead,
All right.
Scott, finish.
Yeah, David, never mind. David answered it. For those people who I said FAC, that's CalPERS Finance and Admin Committee. Some people might not know what that means. So I mentioned that.
No, I appreciate that, Scott. I know we're known for all of our acronyms around here. David, could you go back to the slide earlier where we showed all the portfolio options? We listed them B1, B2. If you could go back to that slide, and maybe this is a question for Sterling. I'll wait till we get there. So these were the portfolios that were provided to the board for consideration. And the question is, portfolio B1 and B2 have the same 6.8% rate of return. B2 includes leverage, but B1 does not. Volatility was virtually the same for both. If leverage goes south, isn't B1 the better choice?
That's actually a good question. So when you look at the portfolio, you could look at any single piece. Leverage is one piece, but we could look at public equities or fixed income and ask the very same question. If that particular asset class goes south, wouldn't we have been better not holding it? And leverage is no different than the other asset classes. So in fact, B2 is a better diversified portfolio. So can we imagine circumstances where leverage might not work? Yes, talked a bit about that. The leverage, though, is something that we use to get more diversifying assets. So overall, we have a better portfolio, and it will tend to be more robust in a wider range of circumstances than the portfolio without the leverage. So I guess part of my answer here is you can't just look at any single piece of a portfolio in isolation. You have to look at the portfolio holistically and ask how it will perform in different circumstances. And that's what a lot of our work did. And that's what our analysis led us to this understanding about how the leverage, in fact, helps to reduce the overall risk. Now, risk is when you measure it, is a probabilistic thing, but the odds are better having used the leverage than not.
All right, thank you, Sterling. Again, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. While we wait to see if any more questions come in, I wanted to offer a couple of reminders. So our board does not meet in December. So our next meetings will be in the new year in 2022. And a couple dates for you just to keep in mind. We have a 2-day meeting in January. It's January 18th and 19th. On the 18th, that's typically a day of education for the board, like fiduciary training. Those topics are still being decided on. But more importantly, we hold a stakeholder forum on January 19th, where we're going to cover a number of topics, things that are priorities for the new year. But more importantly, we're going to have time to network with our board members, allow our stakeholders to have some time with them to talk about any concerns you have, anything that you're thinking about going forward. And so look for more information on those 2 dates, January 18th and 19th in the new year. And we will be sending out some information regarding the dates and the agenda. And one last question, what does it mean for leverage to go south?
I'll take a shot at that one. I guess I interpreted that as meaning that it's not working out for us for some period of time.
Right. Yeah, that's how I interpret it as well. Okay, one last call for any questions. Let's give a few seconds here. All right, it looks like we have answered all the questions that we have today. And I see something just came in. Can you link to the Finance and Administration Committee reports? And yes, we can. Our stakeholder relations team will send out those links for all the agenda items that were recently presented to our board. So everyone, thank you very much for your time today. We really appreciate it. Our stakeholder relations team's here to answer any follow-up questions that you have, so please feel free to email them. And thank you to Scott, Sterling, and Michael for this informative presentation. So have a very good day and happy holidays if we don't see you. Thank you.